The desert did not need to destroy Rome in a single charge. It only needed to keep its distance. On a wide plain near Carrhae, in northern Mesopotamia, Roman legionaries stood beneath the heat with their shields locked, their standards raised, and their formations still intact. These were not inexperienced soldiers. They belonged to a military system that had broken kingdoms across the Mediterranean. Roman armies had defeated Macedonian phalanxes, crushed rebellions, destroyed Carthage, and forced much of the eastern Mediterranean into submission. But on this battlefield, Rome faced a problem it could not solve with discipline alone. The enemy refused to come close. Parthian horse archers circled beyond the reach of Roman swords. Arrows fell from the front, from the flanks, and from angles the legionaries could not easily answer. When the Romans advanced, the horsemen withdrew. When the Romans stopped, the arrows returned, and behind the lighter cavalry waited armored Parthian cataphracts, ready to strike if the Roman line broke apart. By the time the battle ended, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome, was dead. Thousands of Roman soldiers had been killed or captured. Several legionary standards had fallen into Parthian hands, and Rome had suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in its history. The Battle of Carrhae, fought in 53 before Christ, did not end the Roman Republic by itself. It did not bring Parthian armies to Italy. It did not destroy Roman military power, but it exposed something Rome rarely wanted to admit. The legions were not invincible everywhere. Much of what we know about Carrhae comes from later Greek and Roman writers, especially Plutarch and Cassius Dio. Their accounts are valuable, but they are not neutral battlefield reports. They were written with moral lessons, political judgment, and sometimes dramatic storytelling in mind. The numbers they give may be exaggerated. The speeches are literary constructions. Some details remain debated by modern historians. But the main outline is clear enough. A Roman army crossed into Parthian territory expecting glory. It found a style of war built around space, mobility, patience, and exhaustion. And Rome paid for that miscalculation in blood. To understand Carrhae, we have to begin with Roman ambition. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic had become the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. Its armies had expanded far beyond Italy. Greece was under Roman control. Macedonia had been defeated. The old Seleucid kingdom in Syria had collapsed into the Roman sphere. Pompey the Great had reorganized much of the eastern Mediterranean, turning kings, cities, and provinces into parts of a wider Roman system. Rome was no longer just defending itself. It was expanding because expansion had become part of its political life. For Roman aristocrats, foreign war was a path to power. A successful commander could return with wealth, fame, loyal soldiers, and the prestige of a triumph. Victory abroad could decide careers at home. The Republic rewarded conquest so heavily that ambition and strategy often became inseparable. Crassus understood this world. He was not a minor figure chasing attention from the margins. He was one of the 3 most powerful men in Roman politics, standing beside Pompey and Julius Caesar in the political arrangement later called the First Triumvirate. Pompey had already won extraordinary military glory. Caesar was gaining his own in Gaul. Crassus had wealth and influence, but he lacked a conquest equal to theirs. Ancient writers often portray him as greedy, and that judgment may contain some truth. But it is too simple to say Carrhae happened only because one man wanted gold. Crassus was operating inside a Roman political culture where military success was the highest form of public legitimacy. He wanted what Rome had trained its leaders to want: victory, prestige, and a name that could stand beside his rivals. his opportunity lay in the east. Beyond Roman Syria stood the Parthian Empire, ruled by the Arsacid dynasty. To many Romans, Parthia seemed like the next great frontier. It controlled lands connected to Mesopotamia, Iran, and the long trade routes reaching toward Central Asia and beyond. It occupied territory that had once belonged to the Seleucid world, and Roman commanders had grown used to seeing Eastern kingdoms bend under pressure. But Parthia was not simply another weakened Hellenistic state. It was a different kind of empire. Parthian power depended heavily on cavalry, aristocratic military households, wide spaces, and a way of fighting that did not resemble Roman warfare. Its horse archers could approach, fire, retreat, and return without offering a stable target. Its heavily armored cataphracts could deliver shock when an enemy had been disordered. In open country, this combination was extremely dangerous. The Roman legion was built around heavy infantry. Its soldiers were disciplined, well-armed, and devastating in close combat. They could march long distances, build fortified camps, endure pressure, and hold formation under conditions that would break many armies. But every military system has limits. Roman infantry needed contact. It needed the enemy to be pinned, pressured, or forced into close battle. The Parthians had no intention of fighting that way. Before we continue, consider subscribing to Ashes of Empire. It helps this channel grow and helps us keep improving the quality of these forgotten war documentaries. Crassus received Syria as his provincial command. From there, he had access to the eastern frontier and the possibility of a campaign against Parthia. The justification for war was not especially strong. Parthia had not launched a massive invasion of Roman territory. There were regional tensions, disputes over influence, and the complicated politics of Armenia and Mesopotamia, but Crassus's campaign was driven largely by Roman initiative. In other words, this was not a desperate defense of Rome. It was a war of ambition beyond a frontier Rome did not fully understand. Crassus crossed the Euphrates and entered Mesopotamia. At first, the campaign did not look doomed. Some local cities may have been willing to cooperate with Rome, or at least avoid resistance until the balance of power became clear. Roman prestige in the east was enormous. Pompey's earlier victories had shown that Roman armies could rearrange kingdoms. It was easy for Crassus to believe the same pattern would continue. But conquest in Mesopotamia was not the same as conquest in Greece, Syria, or Anatolia. The landscape mattered. The open plains and desert margins favored cavalry. Distance strained supply. Heat wore down men and animals. The further the Roman army moved from secure lines of communication, the more vulnerable it became. A heavy infantry army could be powerful and still be in danger if it marched where water, intelligence, and cavalry support were insufficient. Crassus had choices. Ancient sources suggest that the Armenian king Artavasdos offered support and advised a northern route through terrain less favorable to Parthian cavalry. Another option would have kept the Romans closer to the Euphrates. Modern historians debate how realistic each alternative was, but the strategic issue is clear. Crassus needed to protect his army from being drawn into open country, where Parthian mobility would dominate. Instead, the Romans moved deeper into dangerous terrain. The sources blame a local guide, often named Ariamnes or Abgarus, who allegedly misled Crassus and encouraged him to cross the open plain. We should treat this carefully. Ancient historians often blamed treacherous guides when explaining military disasters, but whether betrayal happened exactly as described or not, the result was the same. The Roman army advanced into a battlefield where the enemy held the advantage. Crassus commanded a large force, commonly described as 7 legions, supported by cavalry and light troops. Exact numbers are debated, but he may have had roughly 35,000 to 40,000 infantry, along with several thousand cavalry and auxiliaries. Among them was his son, Publius Crassus, a young officer with experience under Julius Caesar in Gaul. Publius brought Gallic cavalry, men who had seen hard fighting in the West. The Romans were not without mounted troops. They simply did not have enough of the right kind. The Parthian army that approached them was commanded not by the king, Orodes II, but by a powerful nobleman known in Roman sources as Surena. His name may actually represent a noble title or family name, rather than a personal name. What matters is that he was a major figure in the Parthian world and an effective commander. Surena's force was probably smaller than the Roman army, but it was built for the battlefield ahead. It included large numbers of horse archers and a smaller number of heavily armored cataphracts. The horse archers carried powerful composite bows and fought from horseback with speed and flexibility. They could choose the range of combat. They could attack without being caught. They could retreat without necessarily being defeated. And Surena had prepared for endurance. According to the sources, camel trains carried extra arrows to resupply the horse archers during the battle. This detail is crucial. The Parthian plan did not depend on one quick barrage. It depended on sustained pressure. The Romans might hope the enemy would run out of arrows. Surena made sure they would not. When the armies met near Carrhae, Crassus formed his men defensively. Fearing encirclement, he arranged the army in a dense square or hollow formation, with infantry facing outward and cavalry positioned to protect the sides. This made sense against a mobile enemy. It reduced the risk of being taken from behind. But it also made the Romans slow, compact, and easy to surround. Then the Parthians attacked. Ancient accounts describe the sound of drums and the sight of Parthian armor flashing beneath the sun. Such details may be dramatized, but they capture the psychological pressure of the moment. The Romans were facing an enemy whose method of war was unfamiliar, unsettling, and difficult to answer. The horse archers moved in. Arrows began to fall. For the legionaries, the shield was their first defense. The Roman scutum covered much of the body, and tight formations could endure missile fire better than loose troops. But no shield could protect every angle indefinitely. Arrows struck shields, helmets, arms, legs, faces, and the exposed spaces between armor. Men could crouch behind their shields, but they could not march, fight, and defend every part of themselves at once. Roman light troops tried to push the horse archers away, but they were driven back. The legionaries could not bring the Parthians to close combat. Whenever they advanced, the horsemen withdrew. Whenever they halted, the attack resumed. The Romans were not being smashed in one dramatic charge. They were being worn down by a battlefield rhythm they could not control. The battle became a test of time, and time favored Parthia. At some point, the Romans may have expected the arrow fire to weaken. That would have been logical. Missile troops usually had limits. But when they saw the Parthians resupplying from camels, that hope collapsed. The attack was not fading. It could continue for hours. Crassus needed to break the pattern. He sent Publius Crassus forward with cavalry, archers, and infantry, including the Gallic horsemen. The goal was to drive off the Parthian horse archers and relieve pressure on the main army. It was an aggressive move, and in many Roman battles aggression had solved moments of crisis. At Carrhae, it deepened the disaster. The Parthians retreated before Publius, drawing him away from the main Roman force. His detachment pursued. Then the enemy turned the space against him. Horse archers surrounded the Romans and Gauls. Cataphracts threatened them at close range. The detachment was isolated, exposed, and unable to return easily to Crassus's main body. The Gallic cavalry fought hard. Ancient writers describe desperate attempts to close with the armored Parthians, even striking at horses or trying to grapple with opponents they could not easily wound. The details may be shaped by Roman admiration for courage in defeat, but the essential point is believable. Publius's force resisted, but it could not escape. Publius was wounded or trapped. Rather than be captured, he died, either by suicide or with help from companions, depending on the account. The Parthians cut off his head and later displayed it before the main Roman army. For Crassus, the blow was personal. For the army, it was devastating. The force sent to save the battle had been destroyed. The cavalry screen was badly weakened. The commander's son was dead. And the Parthians had shown that they could isolate part of the Roman army, annihilate it, and return to continue the attack. The main Roman formation still stood, but it was now trapped in a shrinking circle of fear. If you want more forgotten conflicts where empires were tested far from the stories they preferred to tell about themselves, subscribe to Ashes of Empire. Every battlefield has a shadow, and some of them are longer than the victories. The Parthian attack continued until evening. The Roman soldiers endured, but endurance was not victory. Their formation protected them from immediate collapse, yet it also kept them under constant pressure. They could not force the enemy into close combat. They could not advance safely. They could not remain forever on the plain. As night approached, Crassus withdrew toward the city of Carrhae, known today as Harran in southeastern Turkey. The city offered walls and temporary shelter, but the Roman army was badly shaken. Many men were dead or wounded. Others were separated. The army that had entered Mesopotamia as an instrument of conquest had become a force trying to survive. The night after the battle was almost as important as the battle itself. Retreat in darkness is dangerous even for a disciplined army. Orders become unclear. Units lose contact. Wounded men slow the march. Fear spreads. The Romans had to move while knowing that daylight would bring the Parthian cavalry again. Some wounded were left behind. Some troops became separated. Some officers acted independently in the confusion. Crassus faced an impossible position. Remaining in Carrhae risked encirclement. Escaping toward rougher or higher ground offered some hope, because broken terrain could reduce the effectiveness of cavalry. The Romans attempted to leave, but the retreat was disorganized. Some men escaped. Cassius Longinus, one of Crassus's officers, managed to withdraw with part of the force and eventually reached safety. This matters because Carrhae was not the complete destruction of every Roman soldier who entered the campaign. But Crassus himself did not get away. Surena understood that the death or capture of Crassus would complete the victory. A defeated army was significant. A dead Roman commander was a political symbol. If Crassus escaped, Rome could still reshape the story. If he died in Parthian hands, the humiliation became much harder to soften. The Parthians offered negotiation. The exact details remain uncertain. The sources describe pressure from exhausted Roman soldiers who wanted Crassus to meet Surena and accept terms. Crassus may have distrusted the offer, but he no longer had many choices. Refusal might condemn the remaining men. Acceptance might be a trap. He went to the meeting. It ended in violence. Crassus was killed during the failed negotiation, though the exact sequence is unclear. Later tradition claimed that molten gold was poured into his mouth as punishment for greed. Modern historians are cautious about this story. It may be moralizing legend rather than fact. But its popularity reveals how Romans and later writers interpreted the disaster. Crassus became a warning about ambition, wealth, and the dangers of seeking glory without judgment. His death ended the campaign. The losses were severe. Ancient sources often give figures around 20,000 killed and 10,000 captured, though these numbers should be treated as estimates, not exact statistics. Even if the figures are imperfect, the scale of the defeat was undeniable. A major Roman army had been shattered. Thousands of soldiers were dead or missing. Many prisoners were taken east into the Parthian Empire, and some traditions place them in distant regions such as Margiana. The details are difficult to verify, but the central reality is clear. Many Roman soldiers never returned home. Then came the loss that cut deepest into Roman pride. The Parthians captured several legionary standards, including the sacred eagles. To modern eyes, a standard may seem like an object. To Rome, it was far more. The eagle represented the identity, honor, and sacred presence of the legion. Losing it was a public disgrace. It meant that Rome's military honor had been taken and displayed by a foreign power. Soldiers could be replaced. Armies could be raised again. But captured eagles became symbols of humiliation. This is one reason Carrhae lingered so long in Roman memory. Rome had suffered terrible defeats before. At Cannae, Hannibal had killed tens of thousands of Romans in a single day, but Rome eventually defeated Carthage and turned that disaster into a story of endurance. Carrhae was different. There was no immediate revenge. No Roman commander marched east and destroyed Parthia in return. The standards remained in Parthian hands for decades. Carrhae could not be easily redeemed. Politically, the defeat struck Rome at a dangerous moment. Crassus had been one of the three great figures balancing power in the Republic. His death did not directly cause the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, but it removed a major pillar from an already unstable political structure. Rome was full of wealth, ambition, military loyalty, debt, rivalry, and fear. The Republic had expanded faster than its institutions could safely manage. Carrhae added another fracture. It also changed the Roman understanding of Parthia. Before the battle, some Romans may have imagined Parthia as another eastern kingdom that could be humbled by a determined invasion. After Carrhae, Parthia had to be treated as a true imperial rival. It had defeated Rome, not by copying Roman methods, but by using its own strengths: cavalry, mobility, distance, and knowledge of the terrain. Rome would not forget the defeat, even when it tried to control its meaning. Julius Caesar later planned a campaign against Parthia before his assassination in 44 before Christ. Mark Antony launched his own eastern campaign years later, and he too suffered from the difficulties of terrain, supply, weather, and Parthian-style warfare. Only in 20 before Christ did Augustus recover the captured standards, not by battlefield revenge, but through diplomacy. Augustus presented their return as a great restoration of Roman honor. That tells us how important the wound still was. More than 30 years after Carrhae, the eagles still mattered enough to become imperial propaganda. Rome had changed by then. The Republic of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar was gone. Augustus ruled a new political order while preserving the language of old institutions. The standards came home, but they came home to a different Rome. The battle also shaped the long frontier between Rome and the Iranian world. Carrhae was not the final word in Roman-Parthian conflict. It was an early warning. For centuries, Rome and Parthia, and later Rome and Sasanian Persia, would struggle over Armenia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the cities between imperial worlds. The Euphrates and the lands beyond it became one of the most contested frontiers in ancient history. Carrhae showed why. Rome could conquer cities, defeat kings, and absorb provinces. But Parthia was not a simple target. Its strength did not depend on defending one capital against a Roman siege or offering one decisive infantry battle. It could trade space for time. It could punish invaders who moved too far from supply. It could make Roman discipline suffer without granting Roman soldiers the close combat they wanted. This was not proof that the legion was obsolete. Roman armies remained formidable. They would win many victories after Carrhae. They would adapt, recruit more cavalry, use allied forces, and continue to fight in the east. But Carrhae proved that the legion was not a universal answer to every enemy and every landscape. That was the lesson Rome disliked. The battle was a defeat of assumptions. Crassus assumed that Roman prestige could carry him deep into Mesopotamia. He assumed that a large army of legions could impose the kind of battle Rome preferred. He assumed that Parthia could be approached like earlier Eastern opponents. Each assumption brought him closer to disaster. Surena understood the opposite. He did not need to destroy Roman courage. He only needed to make Roman courage ineffective. He did not need to break the legions in a frontal assault. He only needed to keep them under pressure until their choices disappeared. That is why Carrhae remains so haunting. It was not a collapse caused by cowardice. The Roman soldiers endured terrible conditions. Publius and his detachment fought hard. The legions maintained formation under sustained missile attack. Their failure was not a lack of bravery. It was the failure of an army trapped inside the wrong kind of war. Ashes of Empire exists for these forgotten turning points, the battles, sieges, and invasions that left powerful states exposed. Subscribe to keep following the conflicts that history never fully buried. In the end, Carrhae was remembered because it could not be comfortably remembered. Roman writers returned to it, but often as a moral wound. Crassus became the ambitious rich man destroyed by his own desire for glory. The Parthians became the distant enemy whose arrows humbled Rome. The lost standards became symbols of shame. The battlefield became a place where Roman power met a limit it had not expected. But beneath the moral lessons is a harder truth. Carrhae was not simply the story of one commander's failure. It was the story of a republic whose politics rewarded conquest, whose leaders competed for military fame, and whose armies were sometimes sent beyond the edge of careful strategy. Crassus marched east because Rome had made glory necessary. His army died because glory did not understand the terrain. The Roman Republic survived Carrhae. But the world that produced the campaign was already breaking. Within a decade, Caesar would cross the Rubicon. Pompey would be defeated. Crassus would be only one dead giant among several. The Republic would descend into civil war and emerge as something else. And far to the east, beyond Syria and the Euphrates, Parthia remained. The empire Rome had expected to humble had instead taught it caution. On the plain near Carrhae, the legionaries waited for an enemy that would not come close enough to be conquered. Their shields held. Their ranks endured. Their standards still stood for a time in the dust. But all around them, the Parthian horsemen kept moving, always near enough to kill, always far enough to survive. That distance was the battle. That distance was the frontier. And for Rome, it became the memory of a day when the legions reached for empire and found only arrows in the open desert.